Cities of gold now sleep beneath the desert, silent witnesses to empires that vanished. The Chronicles of Collapse tell a dramatic story of forgotten civilizations, and their downfalls hold urgent lessons for our world today. By the end of this journey, you will understand the hidden patterns that cause societies to crumble. We will uncover why a people who built the world's first urban sanitation simply walked away from their cities, and how a sea empire fell silent overnight under a blanket of volcanic ash. What does the fate of these lost empires make you wonder about our own civilization's future? A vast civilization simply walked away from its cities. The Indus Valley people, also known as the Harappans, built one of the most sophisticated societies of the ancient world. Their cities were marvels of planning, with straight streets laid out in grids, advanced drainage systems, and uniform baked bricks used from one end of their territory to the other. They thrived for centuries across a region larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Yet this great society left behind no grand palaces, no colossal statues of kings, and no temples filled with treasure. We have found no evidence of mighty armies or great battles. Their script, etched onto small seals, remains a profound mystery, a language we cannot read, locking away their stories, their names, and their prayers. What kind of civilization achieves such harmony without the apparent need for warrior kings? Archaeologist Jonathan Mark Kenoyer points to the incredible uniformity in their bricks and weights across vast distances, suggesting a highly organized society connected by trade and a shared culture. Yet we have no deciphered records of their rulers or beliefs. Their end was as quiet as their existence. Around 1900 BC, the lights began to go out, not in a sudden blaze, but one by one. At sites like Mohenjo-Daro, layers of silt hint at devastating floods that may have repeatedly drowned their lower towns. Elsewhere, the great river they called the Saraswati, the lifeblood of their cities, began to dry up, its waters shifting away. We see this not in layers of ash from invaders, but in the slow, sad decline of their craftsmanship. The beautiful, standardized pottery gives way to cruder, local styles. The intricate beadwork disappears. The cities were not destroyed, they were left. People simply stopped maintaining the public baths and the complex drains, and they moved on. This was not a conquest, it was a slow unraveling. What if their downfall was a quiet catastrophe of environmental stress, a gradual disconnect from the resources that made their society possible? How does a civilization decide, street by street, house by house, that a place is no longer home? The silence of the Indus Valley invites us to consider how even the most advanced and peaceful societies can fade without a single, dramatic cause. Their greatest mysteries written not in stone, but in the slow retreat of water and the dust of abandoned streets. This gentle collapse leads us to a far more violent and sudden end, one written in the stars and frozen in time. While the Indus Valley faded in quiet retreat, another civilization was silenced in a single, earth-shattering day. The Minoan world was one of vibrant color and life. Their great palace at Knossos was a labyrinth of bustling courtyards and storerooms, its walls alive with frescoes of leaping dolphins and athletic youths vaulting over the backs of charging bulls. This was a society so advanced and confident that they built no massive walls around their cities, a people who ruled the waves from their island of Crete, their merchant ships connecting the ancient world. Historian Rodney Castleton described them as perhaps the first true sea empire, a thalassocracy whose power flowed from the ocean. Then, around 1600 BC, the island of Thera, 100 kilometers to the north, tore itself apart. The volcanic eruption was one of the most violent in human history. It sent a colossal tsunami racing across the Aegean Sea, a wall of water that would have smashed into Crete's northern coast, scouring its proud harbors and fleet from the map. The sky darkened for years under a blanket of volcanic ash, which poisoned the soil and blotted out the sun, leading to failed harvests and famine. You can walk through the ruins of Akrotiri on Thera today, a Minoan town frozen in time, its multi-story buildings perfectly preserved under layers of pumice, a snapshot of a busy community abruptly entombed. Back on Crete, the evidence is just as stark. Archaeological layers at Minoan sites show not just water damage, but also fire, as if the world was ending twice over. Their trade with Egypt, so vital to their wealth, suddenly vanishes from the records. The Minoans, masters of the sea, were ultimately brought down by the very forces of nature that their maritime prowess could not control. Their vibrant culture, which may have inspired the later Greek myth of the Minotaur's labyrinth, was left broken and vulnerable. In their weakened state, they could not resist the eventual arrival of the more warlike Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, who moved in and took control. The Minoan voice, once so vivid on those palace walls, was erased almost overnight. How does a society so brilliantly adapted to its environment become so perfectly vulnerable to a single catastrophic event? Their story is a stark lesson in the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations when faced with the raw, unpredictable power of the planet. This dramatic external collapse stands in sharp contrast to an empire that crumbled from within, torn apart by its own success. The colossal stone gates of Hattusa still stand guard over a silent plain. This was the nerve center of the Hittite Empire, a powerhouse that for centuries challenged the might of Pharaoh's Egypt. From their heartland in ancient Turkey, the Hittites forged a realm not just through military might, but through brilliant innovation. They were masters of iron, turning a once rare metal into the tools and weapons that underpinned their power. Their diplomatic skill was legendary, culminating in the world's first fully recorded peace treaty, signed with Egypt after the epic stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh. This was not a kingdom of brutes, but a sophisticated state, as historian Trevor Bryce notes, pioneering complex laws and a system of governance that held their diverse empire together. Yet around 1180 BC, it all came crashing down. Their magnificent capital, Hattusa, was consumed by a great fire and deliberately abandoned. What could bring such a giant to its knees? The answer lies not in a single enemy, but in a perfect storm of crises. Mysterious groups known only as the Sea Peoples raided coastlines, destabilizing the entire Mediterranean trade network that the Hittites relied upon. At the same time, subject peoples saw the empire's weakness and rose in rebellion, fracturing it from within. And then there was the slow, silent killer, drought. Clay tablets from Hattusa's final days are filled with desperate pleas for grain, revealing a central government begging its own regional governors for food, its agricultural base collapsing under prolonged famine. You can almost hear the desperation in the words of a Hittite queen who wrote to Egypt, "My brother, there is no grain in our lands. How does an empire that perfected the art of war and diplomacy simply starve?" Their carefully maintained network of allies and supply routes frayed and then snapped, leaving each city to fend for itself. The Hittite collapse is a stark lesson in interdependence, a reminder that even the most formidable fortress can fall when its foundations are weakened by multiple, simultaneous attacks, both from outside and from within. This unraveling of a complex state leads us to a different kind of failure, an empire that stretched itself so thin it simply tore apart at the seams. The gates of Hattusa fell silent, a victim of internal fractures, but in the jungles of Cambodia, an empire built a paradise that was ultimately consumed by its own design. Angkor Wat, with its 5 iconic towers, is merely the grandest fragment of a city that once sprawled across 1,000 square kilometers, the heart of the Khmer Empire. For 6 centuries, the Khmer kings ruled Southeast Asia, and their power did not stem from walls alone, but from water. They engineered a breathtakingly complex hydraulic network of canals, moats, and vast reservoirs called barrays, turning the monsoon-drenched landscape into a machine for growing rice and sustaining a population of perhaps 1 million people. This was a civilization that literally sculpted its environment to its will. Archaeologist Damian Evans, using LiDAR technology that peers through the dense forest canopy, has revealed the stunning truth: a sprawling urban landscape of roads, temples, and dwellings organized around this intricate water grid. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a system designed for a specific rhythm of nature. But what happens when that rhythm changes? The empire's decline in the 15th century appears not as a sudden invasion, but as a slow suffocation. Decades of weakened monsoons, possibly linked to a shifting global climate, meant the life-giving rains failed to fill the reservoirs. At the same time, the very success of the empire created its own downfall. Widespread deforestation to expand rice paddies and feed the growing city led to catastrophic soil erosion. Canals and giant reservoirs like the West Barray, which once held billions of liters of water, began to choke with silt, their capacity dwindling season after season. The system that had nourished a metropolis was now failing it. You can see the evidence in the sediment layers, a silent record of declining water management. The rice harvests that fed the army, the artisans, and the priests began to fail. The political and spiritual authority of the god-kings of Angkor, so tied to their control of water, eroded along with the canals. In this weakened state, the empire became vulnerable to pressures from rising neighboring states like Ayutthaya, which repeatedly raided the crippled capital. Eventually, the court simply gave up on its monumental heart, shifting the political center to Phnom Penh and leaving Angkor to the relentless embrace of the jungle. How could such a profound understanding of engineering lead to such a catastrophic blind spot? The Khmer's mastery of water became their trap, a rigid infrastructure that could not adapt when the climate itself turned against them. Their story is a haunting question for our own world, where we build immense cities in deserts and complex networks reliant on stable conditions. What does it mean when our greatest strengths become our most critical vulnerabilities? This lesson in ecological overreach finds a strange parallel in an empire that did not fail from a lack of resources, but from a sudden rupture in the very trade routes that made it rich. The Kingdom of Aksum left behind obelisks that pierced the Ethiopian sky, silent monuments to a lost global power. This was no isolated African kingdom, but a commercial titan whose coins, stamped with the faces of its kings, circulated from the Roman Empire all the way to India. From the 1st to the 8th centuries, Aksum sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, its red seaports buzzing with ships carrying ivory, gold, and exotic spices. It was a society sophisticated enough to mint its own currency and influential enough to adopt Christianity as a state religion, building magnificent churches like the original foundation of St. Mary of Zion. The historian Stuart Munro Hay emphasized that the discovery of Aksumite coins in distant India speaks to a vast economic reach, a network of trade that was the very lifeblood of the empire. But this global connection would also become its greatest vulnerability. In the 7th century, a political earthquake reshaped the world. The rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates swept across the Middle East and North Africa, and in the process, they seized control of the Red Sea trade routes. Suddenly, the ships that had carried Aksum's wealth began to bypass its ports. the empire was cut off from the international markets that had funded its grandeur, economically stranded in its own highlands. This external shock was compounded by an internal decay that had been slowly unfolding for generations. To support its growing population and ambitious construction projects, Aksum had engaged in intensive farming and widespread deforestation. The fertile soil that had once yielded abundant harvests was now washing away, exhausted and eroded. You can see the evidence of this today in the fallen Great Stele of Aksum, the largest obelisk the kingdom ever attempted to erect. It lies broken on the ground where it fell, a powerful symbol of ambition shattered by a weakened foundation. As the farmland failed and trade dried up, the population had no choice but to abandon the magnificent capital. They migrated to the more fertile and defensible highlands, turning their backs on the stone stelae and royal tombs. The court moved, the power shifted, and the great city was left to the elements. How does a society so brilliantly connected to the world become so completely marginalized? Aksum's story is a profound lesson in the volatility of economic dependencies, a warning that prosperity built on the flow of global trade can vanish when that flow is redirected. It showcases a collapse driven by a fatal combination of external political shifts and the slow, silent degradation of the local environment. This reliance on a fragile economic web leads us to consider an empire that took the opposite path, one that collapsed not from being cut off, but from the sheer, unsustainable cost of its own relentless expansion. High on the sun-baked cliffs of Mesa Verde, entire cities hang suspended in time. These were the homes of the Ancestral Puebloans, a people who mastered one of North America's most challenging landscapes. For more than 7 centuries, from around 600 to 1300 CE, they did not just survive in the arid Southwest, they flourished, building a sophisticated society of multi-story stone villages tucked into sheer canyon walls. Their success was a testament to incredible ingenuity. They perfected dry farming techniques, cultivating maize, beans, and squash in dusty soil, and engineered intricate check dams to capture every precious drop of sporadic rain. Their world was one of complex social and ceremonial life, centered on great kivas, circular underground chambers used for community gatherings. Yet, by the end of the 13th century, they made a monumental decision. They walked away from their magnificent cliff dwellings, from the stone towers of Choco Canyon, and from the lands their ancestors had called home for generations. Tree ring data, which provides a precise record of past climate, reveals the primary culprit, a devastating megadrought that gripped the region for decades. This was not just a few dry years, it was a profound, generations-long shift that would have withered crops and emptied water stores. But the story is more complex than just a lack of rain. In some settlements, archaeologists have uncovered unsettling evidence of conflict, including burned structures and human remains showing signs of violence. This suggests that as resources grew desperately scarce, the social fabric that had held communities together for so long may have begun to fray. In the face of this crisis, we see a fascinating pattern of consolidation. Smaller, scattered villages were gradually abandoned as people gathered into much larger pueblos, perhaps for mutual defense or to pool their dwindling resources. At places like Choco Canyon, the departure appears to have been deliberate and organized. Rooms in the great houses were carefully cleaned out, and doorways were sealed, suggesting a ritual closing, a respectful farewell to a sacred place. This was not a panicked flight, but a planned migration. Families packed their belongings and their traditions and moved south and east, following the promise of water to places like the Rio Grande Valley, where their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples, live today. How does a civilization decide that its deepest homeland is no longer viable? The Ancestral Puebloans teach us that adaptation is not always about staying. sometimes the ultimate act of resilience is to leave. Their quiet exodus from the cliffs echoes in our own era of rising seas and shifting climate patterns, asking us what we, too, might be forced to leave behind. This story of a people outmaneuvered by a changing environment stands in stark contrast to the fate of an empire that was swiftly and decisively conquered by the sword. Nineveh's towering walls were said to be so wide that 3 chariots could race along their battlements side by side. This was the nerve center of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a military machine of unparalleled ferocity that dominated the ancient Near East for 3 centuries. From the 10th to the 7th centuries BCE, their influence stretched from the Nile Delta to the highlands of Iran, an empire held together by the sheer terror of their army. They pioneered the use of iron weaponry and complex siege engines, and their tactics were psychological as much as they were physical. They publicly documented the flaying, impalement, and mass deportations of rebellious populations, using fear as a primary tool of governance. Yet within the heart of this brutal state lay a profound contradiction: the great library of King Ashurbanipal, a repository of tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets containing the Epic of Gilgamesh, medical texts, and astronomical observations. This was an empire of both ruthless conquest and deep scholarship. Historian Karen Radner notes that the Assyrian state was highly centralized, a strength that became its greatest weakness. All power, all tribute, and all decisions flowed back to Nineveh, creating a rigid system with no room for flexibility. The very terror that cowed their subjects for generations ultimately forged the instrument of their destruction. Decades of resentment and brutality had sown deep hatred across the conquered lands, and when external pressures mounted, these simmering grievances ignited. A coalition of former victims, the Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and others, united by their shared loathing for Assyrian rule, converged on the capital. The Babylonian Chronicles describe the siege of 612 BCE in vivid detail, a relentless assault that saw the mighty walls breached and the city put to the torch. The royal palaces were looted and destroyed, and the great library, that incredible collection of knowledge, was burned. The fire that consumed the clay tablets ironically baked them solid, preserving them for millennia while simultaneously wiping their contents from the living world. How does an empire built on fear eventually incite the unity of its enemies? The Neo-Assyrian collapse was a direct result of imperial overstretch, the economic strain of constant warfare, and a political strategy that created far more enemies than allies. Their centralized power structure, so effective in control, shattered completely when the core was struck. The empire did not fade, it exploded from within and without, a stark lesson in the self-defeating nature of rule by terror. This dramatic implosion of a superpower leads us from the fire-scorched ruins of Nineveh to an empire that met its end not by the sword, but by the slow, silent encroachment of the desert sands. The ruins of Nineveh stand as a monument to conquest, but deep in the Sahara, an empire fell not by the sword, but by the slow, invisible draining of its lifeblood. The Garamantes carved a civilization from the harshest of deserts. From around 500 BC to 700 CE, their kingdom was a network of hidden oases in the heart of the Libyan desert, a vibrant hub in a sea of sand. Their power did not come from armies, but from an incredible feat of engineering. They mastered a system of underground tunnels known as Fagara, which tapped into ancient fossil water that had been trapped deep underground for millennia. These tunnels, sloping gently for miles, brought this precious resource to the surface without it evaporating in the blistering sun, creating a green paradise where agriculture and cities could flourish. Archaeologist David Mattingly calls them the pioneers of trans-Saharan trade, their camel caravans forging the first reliable links between the Mediterranean world and the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa, trading in salt, glass, and precious goods. Yet their brilliance contained the seed of their own demise. The very water that gave them life was a finite resource, a geological inheritance they were spending faster than it could ever be replenished. Over centuries, the water table began to drop. Maintaining the Fagara tunnels became a desperate, losing battle. They would silt up with sand, requiring constant, back-breaking labor to clear, only to yield less and less water each year. At their capital, Jerma, archaeologists can trace this decline through the layers of occupation. The grand buildings were gradually abandoned. The fields that once grew wheat and dates shrank back into the desert. As the water failed, their centralized power and settled way of life became impossible. The social structure that built this network fragmented. People had no choice but to abandon their cities and return to a more nomadic existence, scattering across the Sahara to survive. Their collapse was also hastened by a drying climate and likely raids from other nomadic groups, but the core of their downfall was the exhausted aquifer. What happens when a society's entire existence is built on a resource that cannot be renewed? The story of the Garamantes is not just an ancient curiosity. It is a stark reflection of modern cities from Phoenix to Riyadh, places that today are dependent on the same kind of finite fossil water. Their silent, sand-choked tunnels ask us a haunting question. How long can any civilization last when it lives by draining a past it cannot restore? This slow suffocation by environmental limits finds a terrifying parallel in an empire brought down not by a lack of water, but by an invisible, microscopic enemy. The silent, sand-choked tunnels of the Garamantes tell a story of a resource slowly running dry. But in the fertile floodplains of North America, another civilization faced a different kind of exhaustion. The great earthen mounds of Cahokia still rise from the Illinois landscape, massive monuments to a society that vanished. At its peak around the year 1100, this city near the Mississippi River was a bustling metropolis, home to as many as 20,000 people, a population that rivaled London at the time. Cahokia was the beating heart of the Mississippian culture, a pilgrimage center where people gathered for vast ceremonies. Its central plaza was flanked by over 120 mounds, with the colossal Monk's Mound towering over all, a man-made mountain covering 14 acres. This was not an isolated chiefdom, but the hub of a vast trade network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, exchanging copper, shells, and prized stones. Anthropologist Timothy R. Pocketat describes it as a political and spiritual capital, a place that remade the world of its people. Yet by the 1300s, this vibrant urban center was silent. What could cause such a densely populated city to dissolve back into the land? The city's grandeur was built on a foundation of maize. Intensive farming of this single crop fueled the population boom, but it came at a heavy cost. To clear land for endless fields of corn, the people cut down the forests that stabilized the soil. Over generations, the fertile topsoil, once enriched by the river's floods, became depleted and began to erode away. You can see the evidence in the later layers of Monk's Mound itself, where signs of erosion and a lack of maintenance reveal a society that could no longer muster the labor or the will to care for its grandest monument. This environmental stress was compounded by a changing climate. The onset of the Little Ice Age likely brought cooler, drier conditions that further strained the already failing agriculture. As harvests dwindled, the social order began to crack. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of tall, defensive palisade walls built around the central ceremonial precinct, stark evidence that conflict had come to the heart of the city. The people who had gathered here for celebration were now building fortifications against each other or against outsiders drawn by the city's fading wealth. In the end, the solution was not war but dispersal. The great urban experiment of Cahokia was gradually abandoned. People left the crowded, resource-strained center and moved out to form smaller, more sustainable villages along the river valleys. The political and spiritual power that once flowed to the city fragmented, scattering back across the landscape. How does a civilization simply choose to walk away from its greatest creation? The story of Cahokia is a powerful lesson in the fragile balance between population, agriculture, and the environment. It reveals how a society's very success can set in motion the forces of its own undoing, and how sustainability is not about the scale of your monuments, but the resilience of your foundations. This quiet fragmentation from within stands in sharp contrast to the fate of an empire that was shattered not by its own choices, but by the arrival of an unstoppable external force. The pyramids of Meroe stand as proud and numerous as those in Egypt, a testament to a kingdom that reversed the tide of history. The Kingdom of Kush did not just trade with the pharaohs, it once conquered them, establishing the 25th dynasty and ruling the entire Nile Valley. For over a millennium, from roughly 800 BC to 350 CE, this was a powerhouse of the African interior. Its early capital at Napata, nestled beneath the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, was a spiritual heart, but the later move to Meroe signaled a shift to an economic and industrial center. Here, the Kushites mastered iron production on an immense scale, their furnaces lighting up the night sky and producing the tools and weapons that fueled their trade across the Mediterranean and deep into the African continent. Scholar Laszlo Turek emphasizes how Kushite culture was a brilliant fusion, adopting Egyptian gods and pyramid building, but then forging its own unique identity with its own language and a distinct artistic style. Yet this powerful blend could not withstand the converging pressures that brought about its end. To the east, the rising Kingdom of Aksum was extending its own commercial networks, gradually choking the trade routes that had been a primary source of Kushite wealth. Aksum's control over Red Sea commerce diverted the flow of ivory, gold, and exotic goods away from the Nile, starving the Kushite economy. At the same time, the land itself was turning against them. A creeping desertification, a slow but relentless drying of the climate, reduced the fertile agricultural land along the Nile, squeezing the kingdom's ability to feed its people. The very success of their iron industry may have contributed to their downfall, as centuries of intensive production likely led to the overmining of timber needed for charcoal, deforesting the landscape and exhausting the most accessible iron ore deposits. The final blow was both political and violent. An Aksumite inscription boasts of a king named Azona who marched his army into the heart of Kush, burning the city of Meroe to the ground. While the city was likely already in decline, this attack was a catastrophic final act. You can read the collapse in the archaeological record through the royal cemeteries. The grand pyramids, built for kings and queens for centuries, become fewer, then cruder, and then they stop entirely. The line of rulers simply vanishes. The population, faced with economic ruin, a degraded environment, and a broken political system, began a slow migration away from the great river, scattering into the hinterlands. Their story remains partially locked away in the Meroitic script, a writing system used for official monuments and pottery that we can still only partially understand. What final lamentations, what records of drought or court intrigue are hidden in those undeciphered symbols? The fall of Kush forces us to ask a difficult question: how much of a civilization's end is due to fierce competition from rivals, and how much is a result of its own unsustainable relationship with the land? Their retreat from the grand stage was not a single event, but a slow unraveling of economy, environment, and political will, a powerful lesson in how the threads of survival can fray all at once. Massive stone heads stare out from the jungle, their features weathered but unmistakably human. These colossal basalt sculptures, some weighing 20 tons, are the most dramatic legacy of the Olmecs, the foundational culture of Mesoamerica. From around 1400 to 400 BCE, they built the first major cities in the region, like San Lorenzo and La Venta, creating a blueprint for all the civilizations that would follow. The Olmecs were true pioneers, developing early forms of writing, a complex calendar, and the ritual ball game that would become a centerpiece of Mesoamerican life. Archaeologist Anne Cyphers points to their incredible achievement in establishing these urban centers, hubs of political and spiritual power. Yet their downfall is wrapped in mystery, marked by a strange and deliberate act, the systematic defacing and burying of their own monuments. Why would a people so carefully inter their greatest symbols of authority? At San Lorenzo, many of the famous colossal heads were mutilated, their features scratched away, and then meticulously buried in long, straight lines. This was not the random violence of invaders, it was a calculated, ritualistic termination. The same pattern appears at La Venta, where precious offerings of jade and serpentine were carefully laid in the ground before the entire ceremonial center was abandoned to the encroaching forest. This suggests a profound internal upheaval, an ideological revolution where the old order, perhaps represented by the rulers depicted in those stone heads, was symbolically overthrown. What could trigger such a dramatic rejection of power? Environmental stress likely played a key role. Shifts in the courses of vital rivers would have devastated the agricultural base of their cities, leading to famine and social unrest. As resources dwindled, the authority of the ruling class, so visibly immortalized in stone, may have been challenged. Competing centers of power were also rising, early Maya groups who absorbed Olmec ideas but forged their own distinct path. The Olmec collapse, therefore, was not a simple disappearance. It was a transformation. Their foundational ideas, from their gods to their glyphs, did not die. They diffused outward, seeding the cultures that would build Teotihuacan and the great Maya city-states. Their story forces us to ask, does a civilization truly end when its core ideas live on, repurposed by its successors? This enigmatic shift in belief and power finds a stark parallel in an empire torn apart not by environmental change, but by a violent and total religious revolution. The great stone walls of Zimbabwe curve against the African sky, an enclosure of dry stone masonry built without mortar, yet standing for centuries. This was the heart of a kingdom that, from the 11th to the 15th century, commanded the trade in gold and ivory across the Indian Ocean. Its merchants sent precious goods to ports as distant as China, and in return received porcelain, glass, and cloth, weaving southern Africa into a global economic web. The society was organized around a sacred king, a ruler whose spiritual and political authority was deeply entwined with the land's prosperity. Historian Innocent Picarei points to Great Zimbabwe as a hub of wealth and power, a city that grew rich from its control over the region's vast resources. But this very source of its greatness would also plant the seeds of its decline. The wealth of Zimbabwe was built on a foundation of cattle and cultivated land, a system that supported a large population of artisans, traders, and elites within the stone walls. Over generations, the land around the capital began to show the strain. Extensive herds overgrazed the fragile soils, and intensive farming to feed the city led to widespread soil depletion. The archaeological record tells a quiet story of this ecological exhaustion. The later stonework at the site lacks the precision and grandeur of the earlier constructions, with walls becoming thinner and less carefully fitted. It is as if the kingdom was losing not just its fertility, but also its confidence. As the land grew tired, the political center could not hold. Oral traditions hint at dynastic disputes and a weakening of the sacred kingship. The famous conical tower, a solid granite structure that may have symbolized the king's authority and the fertility of the state, stood as a monument to a power that was waning. The elite, sensing the shifting fortunes, began a deliberate migration. They moved their court north to new centers like Khmer and eventually the Mutapa kingdom, taking their authority with them and establishing new trade routes that bypassed the old capital. Great Zimbabwe was not conquered, it was simply left behind. How does a trading empire lose its economic edge? Zimbabwe's story shows that wealth built on finite resources is profoundly vulnerable. When the environment that supports your economy degrades, and when new competitors arise to divert the flow of commerce, even the most imposing stone walls cannot protect you from a slow, internal unraveling. This lesson in the fragility of resource-based power finds a terrifying parallel in an empire that was not slowly drained, but instantly shattered by the raw force of the earth itself. The towering adobe pyramids of the Moche stand like giants of sun-baked earth against Peru's coastal desert. For 700 years, from 100 to 800 CE, this civilization transformed one of the driest places on Earth into a flourishing society. They were masters of metallurgy, crafting intricate gold and copper headdresses, and their pottery depicts an entire world with stunning realism, showing everything from warriors in combat to elaborate ceremonies. At the heart of their society were priest rulers who mediated between the people and the gods, their authority cemented by control over a life-giving resource, water. They engineered vast and complex irrigation canals that snaked through the desert, diverting water from rivers flowing from the Andes to feed fields of maize, beans, and squash. This was a theocratic state, a society where spiritual power and political control were one and the same, all built upon the predictable flow of water. But what happens when that predictability shatters? Archaeologist Luis Jaime Castillo points to the Moche's stunning art as a window into their worldview, but notes their collapse appears tied directly to climatic extremes like El Niño events. These were not gentle shifts in weather, but violent oscillations between decades of drought and catastrophic flooding. A super El Niño would have sent torrential rains crashing down from the Andes, turning their peaceful rivers into raging walls of water and mud. These monstrous floods would have smashed through their carefully maintained canal systems, wiping out generations of agricultural infrastructure in a single season. The evidence is stark at places like the Huaca del Sol, the massive pyramid of the sun, where entire sections of the structure appear to have been deliberately washed away, perhaps in an act of ritual termination or simply by the sheer force of the water. This was followed by prolonged periods of drought, where the rivers ran low and the repaired canals could not deliver enough water. The result was widespread famine. In this state of desperation, the social contract broke. The priest rulers who had promised to intercede with the gods for rain and fertility lost their divine mandate. We find evidence of this collapse in mass burials and in the scorched remains of temples that were violently burned. The old order was being torn down. Yet, even in this chaos, there is a powerful story of resilience. At the site of San Jose de Moro, archaeologists uncovered the tomb of a powerful priestess, buried with elaborate regalia during the very period of the civilization's decline. This suggests that while the central power structure was fracturing, new forms of leadership, perhaps led by women, were emerging to guide the people through the crisis. The Moche did not vanish without a trace. Their knowledge, their artistic traditions, and their spiritual beliefs were absorbed and transformed by the later Chimu culture, which would build its own empire upon the same landscape. How does a civilization find the strength to reinvent itself when its very foundations are washed away? The Moch teach us that collapse is not always an end, but sometimes a painful, necessary transformation, a shedding of one skin so another can emerge. This profound adaptation through crisis leads us to the final forgotten empire, one whose name was erased from history itself. A vibrant civilization can be erased not by conquest, but by embrace. The Etruscan League, a collection of powerful city-states in ancient Italy, presents a paradox, a society that profoundly shaped its conqueror only to be consumed by it. For 500 years, from the 8th to the 3rd centuries BC, the Etruscans were the dominant cultural force in the peninsula. Theirs was a world of sophisticated artistry, deep religious devotion, and bustling trade, a people whose influence on a young Rome was immeasurable. They gave Rome the symbols of its power, the fasces, the purple-bordered toga of its magistrates, and even the very art of divination, reading the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the entrails of sheep. Yet their political structure, a loose confederation of 12 major cities, lacked the central unity of their rising neighbor. As historian Jean McIntosh Turfer observed, the Etruscans were master metalworkers and traders, yet their political fragmentation made them vulnerable to Roman expansion. This was not a collapse of fire and slaughter, but a slow, inexorable absorption. The process began with a pivotal military defeat, the Roman sack of the great city of Veii in 396 BC. After a 10-year siege, the fall of this Etruscan stronghold just a dozen miles from Rome shattered the League's northern defenses and demonstrated Roman resolve. Other cities, like the wealthy Srivijaya, once a maritime power, found their influence waning as Rome's control over trade routes tightened. Rather than unified resistance, Etruscan cities often made separate, short-sighted alliances with Rome, pacts that inevitably backfired and drew them deeper into the Roman sphere. Step by step, treaty by treaty, the Etruscan world was enclosed. The true end came not on the battlefield, but in the home and the forum. Romans eagerly adopted Etruscan engineering, religious rituals, and architectural styles, stripping them of their original cultural context and making them Roman. The Etruscan language, utterly unique and unrelated to Latin, began a long retreat, surviving only in religious contexts before fading into complete obscurity. We see this cultural evaporation vividly in places like the Tomb of the Reliefs at Srivijaya. Its walls are sculpted to mimic a lively Etruscan home, with carved reliefs of cooking pots, armor, and even a friendly little hellhound, a snapshot of a vibrant, confident domestic life. Yet within a few generations, such distinct traditions were overwhelmed by the homogenizing force of Roman custom. How does a civilization so culturally rich simply fade away? The Etruscan demise forces us to ask whether integration is just a gentler form of destruction. Their story is a quiet warning about the power of a dominant culture to assimilate and erase, not through malice, but through the sheer gravitational pull of its expanding identity. This subtle loss of self stands in stark contrast to an empire that imploded from a very different kind of internal decay. Gold gleamed in the Lydian capital of Sardis, a city so rich its very name became a byword for wealth. This kingdom in western Anatolia, thriving from the 7th to the 6th centuries BC, did more than just mine gold from the river Pactolus. It revolutionized the ancient economy by inventing coinage. These stamped pieces of electrum, a natural gold and silver alloy, standardized value and turbocharged trade, making the Lydian kings the bankers of the ancient world. They sat astride vital land routes connecting the Aegean coast to the empires of the East, amassing a fortune that seemed to make them invincible. King Croesus, the last and most famous of these monarchs, embodied this prosperity, his court a spectacle of luxury that fed legends for centuries. Yet this immense economic power masked a critical vulnerability. As historian John Boardman observes, Lydia's wealth was legendary, but its military reliance on mercenaries and oracle misinterpretations led to its downfall. Croesus built his army not on the loyalty of citizen soldiers, but on the purchased service of foreign fighters, a force whose commitment could vanish as quickly as the gold that paid them. This fragile might was tested when he decided to confront the rising power of Persia, led by its brilliant and ambitious king, Cyrus the Great. Consulting the famous oracle at Delphi, Croesus was told that if he attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Interpreting this as a prophecy of certain victory, he launched his campaign only to discover, in the brutal logic of war, that the empire to be destroyed was his own. The Lydian and Persian armies met in a fierce but inconclusive battle, after which Croesus, assuming the campaigning season was over, dismissed his expensive mercenaries for the winter. Cyrus, however, defied all convention. He kept his army together and marched straight for the Lydian capital. The final confrontation took place on the plains before Sardis. The historian Herodotus dramatizes the event, describing how Cyrus used a cunning tactic, placing his camels in the front line to spook the renowned Lydian cavalry horses, which were unfamiliar with the strange animals. The Lydian lines broke, and the Persians swept into the city, capturing Croesus in 546 BCE. The story of Croesus on the pyre, saved from the flames by the god Apollo, became a powerful Greek moral tale about the fickleness of fortune, a warning that no amount of wealth could guard against a fatal misstep. In practical terms, Lydia was swiftly absorbed into the vast Persian Empire. Its legendary riches filled the coffers of Cyrus, and its skilled craftsmen and innovative economic systems were integrated into a new imperial machine. The fall of Lydia forces a difficult question: what role does leadership and external threats play in the collapse of wealthy states, and how can economic power alone be insufficient? Croesus had all the money in the world, but he lacked reliable military strength, made a catastrophic strategic error, and fatally misread a divine sign. His story is a timeless lesson that gold alone cannot build a lasting fortress, especially when faced with a determined and adaptable rival. This dramatic fall of a kingdom undone by its own riches and misjudgments stands in stark contrast to an empire that was slowly, silently consumed by the desert it had once conquered. The treasury of Petra glows like a rose in the desert sun, a monument carved not from stone but from profit. The Nabateans were masters of the arid landscape, building their entire kingdom on the control of a single precious commodity, the incense trade. For centuries, their capital was the indispensable crossroads where caravan routes carrying frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia met the markets of the Mediterranean. Their genius lay not just in commerce but in survival. In a land of brutal droughts, they engineered a hydraulic marvel, a network of dams, terracotta pipes, and vast cisterns that captured every scarce drop of winter rain, allowing a city of 30,000 to thrive in the heart of the desert. Archaeologist Lee Ann Bedal emphasizes how the Nabateans engineered sophisticated dams and cisterns, turning a barren canyon into a lush, defensible stronghold. But this brilliance was also their cage. Their entire society was built around a single economic engine, and when that engine began to fail, the entire system seized. The first blow was political. In 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan formally annexed the kingdom, absorbing it into the province of Arabia Patria. While Petra was not destroyed, its autonomy was stripped away. The Romans now controlled the trade routes and the lucrative taxes, diverting the flow of wealth away from the Nabatean elite and into imperial coffers. Then came the earthquakes, a series of tremors around 363 C that shattered their meticulously built water channels and damaged the very cliff-carved facades that were their signature. But the most devastating change was the slow, inexorable shift in global commerce. As Roman ships mastered the sea routes directly from Arabia to Egypt, the long, arduous, and expensive overland caravans through Petra became obsolete. Why travel by camel when you could ship by sea? The city's economic lifeblood was slowly cut off. You can trace this decline in the slow abandonment of the city center. The grand tombs, like the iconic treasury, became empty monuments, their original purpose forgotten. The population dwindled as people migrated to new economic hubs, including their southern capital of Hegra. The Nabateans' monopoly on the incense trade evaporated, and with it, their reason for existence in that unforgiving canyon. How does a trade-based empire adapt when its economic lifelines are cut? Petra's silent, magnificent ruins stand as a stark lesson in the danger of a singular focus. Their story forces us to ask what happens when a civilization's greatest strength becomes its only identity, leaving it with nothing to fall back on when the world changes. This dramatic loss of economic purpose leads us to an empire that failed for the opposite reason, collapsing not from being too connected, but from being utterly, disastrously alone. Her legendary visit to King Solomon's court was more than a story. It was the echo of a real empire built on scent. The kingdom of Saba, the source of the Queen of Sheba's power, transformed the arid landscapes of southern Arabia into a green paradise for 1,000 years. Its wealth was not in gold, but in frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins so prized in the ancient world that they were worth their weight in silver. This monopoly on the incense trade funded magnificent temples and cities, but the true heart of the kingdom was not a palace, it was a dam. The Great Marib Dam was a wonder of hydraulic engineering, a massive earth and stone structure that captured seasonal rains, allowing the Sabaeans to cultivate a vast oasis in the desert. For centuries, this system turned the region into a breadbasket, supporting a population large enough to sustain its commercial ambitions. Yet this brilliant infrastructure contained a fatal flaw. The very water that gave life also carried death in the form of silt, eroded soil washed down from the highlands. Each flood season deposited a fresh layer of this sediment into the reservoir behind the dam, slowly but surely reducing its capacity to hold water. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a desperate, centuries-long battle against this inevitable decay. Inscriptions and physical remains tell of repeated repairs, of kings boasting of restoring the dam's glory, each project a temporary fix in a losing war. The historian Kenneth A. Kitchen points to this cycle of siltation and repair as a slow drain on the kingdom's resources and morale. As the dam's effectiveness waned, so did the agricultural output. A series of catastrophic final breaches, mentioned even in the Quran as a divine punishment for ingratitude, unleashed floods that destroyed the carefully irrigated farmland, leading to widespread famine. This environmental crisis was compounded by a shifting economic world. The Romans, tired of paying exorbitant prices to Sabaean middlemen, began to bypass them entirely, sending their own ships directly to the source of the incense in Arabia. The overland caravan routes that had been Saba's lifeline began to dry up, their wealth diverted to the sea. Internally, the kingdom was cracking. Dynastic squabbles and political fragmentation weakened the central authority needed to organize the massive communal labor required to maintain the dam. The kingdom fractured, and a rising power, the Himyarites, gradually absorbed the weakened Sabaean state. What happens when the very engineering that defines a civilization begins to fail? Saba's story is a powerful lesson in the relentless demands of maintenance. It shows that no matter how brilliant an initial innovation, without the political unity and collective will to sustain it, the foundation of any society can silt up from within. This quiet collapse of a legendary kingdom lost to the sands now leads us to a final empire, one whose name and memory were so completely erased that its very existence became a myth. The desert sands of the Tarim Basin cradle mummies with startlingly fair hair and European features, dressed in brightly patterned woolen textiles that speak of a distant homeland. These were the Tocharians, a people who built a network of prosperous oasis city-states along the Silk Road for nearly 3,000 years. In places like Kucha and Turfan, they acted as the crucial middlemen between the great empires of China and the West, their caravans carrying silk, spices, and ideas. They were not just merchants, but a deeply cultured people who adopted Buddhism and developed a unique artistic style, leaving behind manuscripts in a language that was completely their own, an Indo-European tongue preserved on clay tablets. Linguist J. P. Mallory reminds us that the Tocharians left behind texts in a forgotten language, but their assimilation into Turkic and Chinese cultures erased their identity. For centuries, their distinct culture thrived in isolation, protected by the vast, encircling desert. Yet this very isolation became their vulnerability. The lifeblood of their cities was the water that fed the oases, and a slow, relentless desiccation of the climate began to shrink these green havens. As the oases dwindled, so did the agricultural base that supported their urban populations. At the same time, the political winds were shifting. The expansion of the Ig Khaganate in the 8th century brought a new, powerful Turkic culture into the region, one that gradually overwhelmed the Tocharian way of life. The old trade routes began to shift, bypassing their cities and cutting off their economic reason for being. You can see this cultural erasure vividly in the Kizil caves, where beautiful Buddhist murals painted in a distinct Tocharian style were later overpainted with new imagery, a visual metaphor for one culture being written over by another. The cities were not destroyed by war, they were simply abandoned, their people gradually converting to Islam and other faiths, their unique language fading from use until it was only a curiosity in ancient manuscripts. Their physical legacy did not vanish, it was simply absorbed, their genes blending into the local populations until their distinct identity melted away. How does a culture maintain its voice when surrounded by much larger, more dominant neighbors? The Tocharians present a haunting lesson in the quiet power of assimilation, showing that a civilization can disappear not with a bang, but through a slow, steady absorption into the tapestry of history. This gentle fading under imperial pressure stands in stark contrast to an empire that exploded from the opposite problem, a relentless drive to expand until there was nothing left to conquer. Even the most enlightened empire can shatter from within. The Mauryan Empire stretched across almost the entire Indian subcontinent, a colossal state unified by the iron will of its third emperor, Ashoka. After his brutal conquest of Kalinga, Ashoka experienced a profound transformation, renouncing violence and dedicating his life to Dhamma, a moral code of non-violence, tolerance, and public welfare. He had his edicts carved onto pillars and rock faces across the land, preaching respect for all life and the importance of ethical conduct. This was a revolutionary vision of governance, an empire built not just on power but on principle. Yet within 5 decades of Ashoka's death around 232 BCE, this vast structure lay in ruins. How could an empire so morally conscious disintegrate so completely? The very centralization that allowed Ashoka to propagate his vision became its greatest weakness. Historian Ramila Thapar notes that Ashoka's centralized governance and moral policies were innovative, but the empire lacked mechanisms to sustain unity after his passing. The system was built around the charisma and authority of a single ruler, with no strong, independent institutions to hold it together once he was gone. The result was a rapid unraveling. Weak successors squabbled over the throne, triggering a series of succession wars that fractured the political core. The imperial bureaucracy, once the engine of Mauryan control, began to fray at the edges. Provincial governors, sensing the power vacuum in the capital Pataliputra, began to assert their own independence. From this chaos, new regional powers emerged, like the Shunga dynasty, which overthrew the last Mauryan king in a military coup. The empire was also bleeding from its frontiers. Incursions by Greco-Bactrian forces from the northwest further strained the weakened state, chipping away at its territories. The economic foundation crumbled as well, with the disintegration of the carefully maintained trade networks that had once funneled wealth into the imperial heartland. You can see this transition at places like the Sanchai Stupa, a magnificent Buddhist monument. Under Ashoka, it was an imperial project, but after the collapse, its expansion and decoration continued under the patronage of local merchants and ordinary citizens. The grand vision of the empire was gone, but the cultural and spiritual life it had nurtured persisted on a smaller, more resilient scale. The fall of the Mauryan Empire forces a difficult question. How does an empire built on ethical governance fail to implant those values into its very structure? Their dramatic fragmentation reveals that even the noblest of intentions are fragile without the practical systems to outlive the leader who championed them. This story of a land empire dissolving from internal pressures now guides us to a civilization that met a very different fate, one that vanished beneath the waves. The power of the Srivijaya kingdom was written not in stone but in water. For 6 centuries, this thalassocracy, or sea empire, ruled from a network of river-mouth ports on Sumatra, its wealth flowing from a single, brilliant strategy, control of the Strait of Malacca. Every ship traveling the spice route between China and India had to pass through this narrow channel, and the Srivijayan kings levied taxes on them all, amassing a fortune that built a cosmopolitan hub of trade and Buddhist learning. Their capital at Palembang was a bustling entrepot, a place where Persian, Tamil, and Chinese merchants mingled. Yet this maritime superpower left behind almost no grand ruins for archaeologists to find. Its palaces and homes were built of wood and thatch, materials that rotted away completely in the humid tropical climate, leaving only whispers in the mud. As archaeologist John Miksic explains, Srivijaya's power was naval and economic, but siltation of rivers and raids by the Chola Empire undermined its hegemony. The very rivers that gave them life and access to the interior began to choke with silt, a slow environmental process that made their ports shallower and harder for large trading vessels to reach. This gradual decline was violently accelerated by external attack. In the 11th century, the powerful Chola Empire of southern India launched a series of devastating naval raids, sacking key ports and shattering the myth of Srivijayan invincibility. Chinese court records, which once meticulously documented regular tribute missions from Srivijaya, show these visits ceasing altogether, a silent testimony to its fading influence. Internally, the kingdom was straining. The Kota Kapur inscription, a stone pillar from the empire's earlier days, lists dire curses against any who would rebel, a threat that hints at the internal strife and challenges to central authority that plagued its final years. With its ports silting up, its naval supremacy broken by the Cholas, and new competitors like the Majapahit Empire in Java rising to dominate the spice trade, Srivijaya's economic reason for being simply evaporated. The court eventually abandoned Palembang, and the once great maritime culture was absorbed into the fabric of later kingdoms. How does an empire that commands the sea lanes simply lose its grip? Srivijaya's story is a profound lesson in the fragility of a power based solely on trade, a reminder that when your wealth flows through a narrow passage, any shift in the current can sweep it all away. This quiet disappearance of a sea empire, lost to silt and shifting alliances, now leads us to a collapse forged in the fires of faith. Thousands of brick temples still rise from the plains of Myanmar, a silent forest of devotion built by the Kingdom of Pagan. For over 4 centuries, from 849 to 1297 CE, this was a realm that unified the region under the banner of the Theravada Buddhism, its power expressed not in armies but in architecture. Rival kings and nobles competed to earn spiritual merit by commissioning ever more magnificent structures, from the elegant symmetry of the Ananda Temple to the towering peak of the Thatpayanu Temple, one of the tallest, which pierced the sky as a symbol of profound piety. Yet this spiritual ambition came with a hidden economic cost. Historian Michael Ong Thwin observed that pagans' economy relied heavily on temple building, which may have diverted vast resources away from defense and agriculture, creating a deep vulnerability. The kingdom's wealth, derived from rice cultivation in the arid plains, was poured into brick and stucco instead of fortifications or sustainable farming. Generations of intensive agriculture to feed the massive labor force exhausted the soil, slowly undermining the very resource base that funded this spiritual enterprise. The political structure was dangerously over-centralized, with all authority flowing from the king, making the state rigid and brittle. When the Mongols, the superpower of the 13th century, turned their gaze south, Pagan was in no condition to resist. In 1287, a Mongol force sacked the capital, not to occupy it but to shatter its power. The invasion was the final, external blow to a system already cracking from within. The king fled, succession crises erupted, and the centralized state fragmented into a constellation of smaller, competing states like Ava. The grand project of temple construction ceased almost overnight. The population, facing political chaos and environmental strain, began a gradual migration away from the old heartland. How does a civilization so dedicated to spiritual glory become blind to the material foundations that support it? The silent, temple-strewn plains of Pagan stand as a haunting lesson in the delicate balance between piety and practicality, a warning that even the most beautiful and devout ambitions can crumble if they drain the strength of the kingdom itself. This collapse, triggered by both external threat and internal neglect, leads us to an empire brought down by a far more invisible and intimate enemy. For more than 1,000 years, the mighty Theodosian walls had kept Constantinople safe. This was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the direct and unbroken continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. It was a civilization that preserved the libraries of classical Greece and Rome, while much of Europe slipped into the Dark Ages, a bastion of Christianity and imperial splendor whose capital was known simply as the city. Yet its story is not one of sudden collapse, but of a prolonged and painful decline, a slow bleed that finally drained the life from the ancient Roman world. Historian Judith Herron observes that Byzantium preserved classical knowledge and Christianity, but internal strife and the Crusaders' sack of Constantinople in 1204 accelerated its demise. That event was a catastrophic betrayal. Christian knights from Western Europe, supposedly on a holy mission, instead turned on their fellow Christians, looting the city for 3 days, destroying priceless artifacts, and establishing their own short-lived Latin Empire on Byzantine soil. The empire never truly recovered from this self-inflicted wound. this shattering of its own spiritual and economic core, the internal decay was just as damaging. A series of civil wars over the throne bled the treasury and military dry, while the government resorted to a desperate measure, the debasement of its currency. They slowly reduced the gold content in their famous solidus coin, once the dollar of the medieval world, creating runaway inflation that crippled trade and tax revenue. Then came the plague. The Black Death swept through the empire in the 1300s, killing perhaps a third of its population, leaving fields untended and armies unmanned. Externally, the pressure was relentless. Turkish armies steadily conquered the empire's heartland of Anatolia, its primary source of food and soldiers. The Byzantines failed to adapt to new military realities, while their Ottoman rivals eagerly embraced the game-changing technology of gunpowder and massive cannons. The final siege in 1453 pitted the ancient walls against these new weapons. For weeks, the defenders held, but the giant cannons of Sultan Mehmed II, including a monstrous piece that could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds, pounded the defenses day and night. When the Ottomans finally breached the walls, the last emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the streets. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the spiritual center of Eastern Christianity for nearly a millennium, was converted into a mosque, its Christian mosaics covered over, a powerful symbol of a profound cultural and political shift. In the aftermath, Greek scholars fled west, carrying precious manuscripts with them, an exodus that helped ignite the European Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople forces a difficult question: what is the true measure of resilience? Is it the ability to endure for 1,000 years, or is it the capacity to adapt and change before it is too late? The Byzantine Empire possessed incredible endurance, yet its long-managed decline shows that even the most resilient structures can be worn down by a relentless combination of internal weakness and external pressure. This story of a fortress slowly overwhelmed now guides us to a civilization that fell to a far more chaotic and unpredictable enemy. The last church bell in Greenland fell silent in the 15th century. For nearly 500 years, Norse settlers had carved out a life in this stark landscape, their farms dotting the sheltered fjords during a time of unusual warmth. They built stone churches, raised cattle and sheep, and maintained a European identity at the very edge of the known world. Their eastern and western settlements were not just outposts but functioning societies, sustained by a vital trade route back to Norway, exchanging walrus ivory and hides for essential iron, timber, and tools. Yet when the climate shifted, their world froze in place. The onset of the Little Ice Age brought longer, crueler winters and shortened the already brief growing season. The grass that fed their livestock grew scarcer with each passing year. Archaeologist Thomas H. McGovern points to a critical failure. The Norse clung to European ways, failing to adopt Inuit hunting techniques, which may have contributed to their demise. While their Thule Inuit neighbors expertly hunted seal and whale through the ice, providing a reliable winter food source, the Norse continued to prioritize their vulnerable cattle, a symbol of their Scandinavian heritage. You can see the consequences of this cultural inflexibility in the skeletal remains from the final years, which show clear signs of chronic malnutrition and increasing stunted growth. The soil itself tells a story of decline, with layers revealing severe erosion caused by generations of overgrazing by their sheep, stripping the thin layer of fertile earth from the fragile landscape. As the climate cooled, the sea ice expanded, making the already dangerous voyage from Norway even more perilous. The trade ships, their lifeline to Europe, came less frequently and then stopped coming altogether. The last recorded ship to reach the settlements never made it back, and no other vessel followed. Isolated and starving, the communities withered. At the Bratolith settlement, the ruins do not speak of a single, fiery end, but of a slow, grinding departure. Farmsteads were abandoned one by one, the doors carefully sealed as if the occupants hoped to return. They left behind their churches, their pastures, and the bones of their starved livestock. How does a society choose cultural identity over survival itself? The fate of the Greenland Norse is a profound lesson in the danger of rigidity, a warning that the most deeply held traditions can become a trap when the environment changes. Their silent farms stand as a monument to a people who could not reinvent themselves, guiding us to an empire that shattered not from ice, but from the fire of internal rebellion. The stone gods of Tiwanaku stare out from the high plains with sightless eyes. High in the Andes, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, this city was the heart of an empire that thrived for centuries on a seemingly impossible agricultural feat. The Tiwanaku people, flourishing from around 300 to 1000 CE, transformed the harsh, oxygen-thin Altiplano into a green engine of plenty. Their secret was a breathtaking network of raised fields, vast platforms of earth surrounded by canals. This system protected crops from frost, recycled nutrients, and created a microclimate that yielded abundant harvests of potatoes and quinoa, supporting a dense urban population and a powerful religious state. Anthropologist Alan L. Carlotta emphasizes that Tiwanaku's raised fields were highly productive, but a mega-drought in the 11th century may have caused crop failures and political fragmentation. This was not a sudden disaster, but a slow, relentless squeeze. The lifeblood of the entire system, Lake Titicaca itself, began to recede. As the lake level dropped over decades, the intricate canal network that fed the raised fields was left high and dry. The once fertile fields became barren platforms of cracked earth. You can see the evidence of this collapse in the very stones of the city. The Great Akapana Pyramid, the central temple mound, shows signs of violent destruction. Its summit was burned and its sacred offerings were smashed, suggesting a furious rejection of the spiritual authority that had failed to bring rain. The people, facing famine, turned on their rulers. Oral traditions collected by later cultures speak of a great famine, a time when the sun was cruel and the earth gave no food. The magnificent Gate of the Sun, a single carved stone portal depicting a central deity, was left behind as the city emptied. It once aligned perfectly with celestial events, a testament to their deep understanding of the heavens, but such knowledge was useless against the changing climate. What role does climate variability play in the stability of agricultural empires? Tiwanaku is a devastating answer. Their brilliant adaptation to a specific environment became a fatal trap when that environment shifted. Yet their legacy did not vanish. The dispersal of their distinctive iconography, the spreading of their artistic symbols and gods, shows that the people migrated. They carried their knowledge and traditions to new valleys, perhaps even seeding the cultural ground for the later rise of the Inca. How can ancient techniques inform modern farming? In a surprising twist, archaeologists and local farmers have begun to reconstruct these very same raised fields, finding that they once again produce incredible yields, offering a sustainable alternative for the high Andes. Tiwanaku's downfall highlights the vulnerability of even the most advanced systems to a changing world, a lesson carved in stone and lost beneath the highland sun, leading us to an empire whose story ends not with drought, but with the swift, decisive strike of a foreign conqueror. While the stone gods of Tiwanaku fell to a changing climate, the Gupta Empire in India collapsed under the weight of its own golden age. From 319 to 550 CE, this dynasty unified much of the subcontinent, presiding over an explosion of creativity in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and art. This was the era when the concept of zero was formally defined, when the decimal system was refined, and when the great poet Kalidasa wrote his timeless Sanskrit dramas. The iron pillar of Delhi, erected during this period, still stands today with minimal rust, a silent marvel of their metallurgical genius. Yet this incredible cultural flourishing could not shield the empire from political decay. Historian Upinder Singh observes that while the Guptas promoted Sanskrit literature and science, their loose feudal structure made it hard to repel external threats. The empire was not a tightly controlled bureaucracy, but a network of semi-independent regional lords who pledged loyalty to the central court. This system worked well when the emperor was strong and trade was booming, but it contained a fatal weakness. The empire's wealth, which funded universities and magnificent temples, flowed from control over lucrative trade routes. When that flow was interrupted, the entire structure began to shudder. The first major cracks appeared with the White Hun invasions from Central Asia. These relentless nomadic warriors began chipping away at the northwestern frontiers of the empire. The Gupta armies, reliant on the forces of their feudal lords, struggled to mount a unified and sustained defense. Key territories were lost, and the security that had allowed internal trade to thrive was shattered. As the central authority weakened, the regional lords, like the rising Vardhanas, saw their chance. They began to withhold troops and taxes, acting more like independent kings than subordinates. You can trace this decline in the fate of great cities like Pataliputra, once a glorious capital, which slowly faded in importance as economic activity dispersed and urban life contracted. The court could no longer afford to patronize artists and scholars on the same grand scale. The very decentralization that had allowed for local cultural flowering now prevented a coordinated response to crisis. How does a civilization experiencing such a profound renaissance fail to secure its own political future? The Gupta collapse teaches a difficult lesson, that cultural brilliance and scientific achievement are not armor against military threat or administrative failure. Their legacy was preserved not in a lasting state, but in the texts they left behind, from the Kama Sutra to the astronomical treatises that would later influence the world. Their story forces us to ask what truly ensures an empire's endurance. Is it the monuments it builds, or the adaptable systems it leaves in place? This delicate balance between cultural splendor and political fragility leads us to our final chronicle of collapse. Golden jewelry and Roman coins lie buried in the mud of the Mekong Delta, remnants of a kingdom that was once the gateway to Southeast Asia. The Kingdom of Funan thrived from the 1st to the 6th centuries, a bustling maritime empire built on the flow of goods and ideas. Its capital was a watery Venice of canals and ports, a nexus where Indian merchants met Chinese traders, exchanging spices for silk. Artifacts unearthed at its great port city of Ok-Eo tell a story of astonishing global reach, with seals from Persia, statues of Hindu gods, and early Buddha images standing alongside coins minted in the Roman Empire. This was a society that did not just engage in trade, it was trade, its identity forged at the crossroads of the world. Yet this brilliant adaptation to geography contained the very seeds of its undoing. The same river systems that gave it life carried a slow, silent curse. For generations, the Mekong River deposited its rich, fertile silt across the delta. But this same process gradually filled the intricate canals and harbors that were Funan's economic arteries. The great port of Ok-Eo, once accessible to deep draft trading vessels, began to choke. The ships from India and beyond found it harder to reach the city, and the lifeblood of commerce started to thin. At the same time, the climate may have turned against them. Shifts in monsoon patterns could have led to periods of drought or catastrophic flooding. disrupting the rice agriculture that supported the urban population. Chinese court records, which once meticulously documented tribute missions from the kings of Funan, note that these visits ceased altogether by the 6th century, a silent administrative admission that a power had faded from the world stage. While the environment weakened Funan, a new power was rising inland. The polity of Chenla, a predecessor to the Angkorian Empire, began to consolidate its power in the interior. As Funan's ports silted up and its trade-based wealth dwindled, Chenla's agrarian, land-based economy proved more resilient. The political center of gravity shifted decisively from the coast to the hinterlands. The fall of Funan was not a violent conquest but a gradual absorption. Its people, its artistic traditions, and its Hindu and Buddhist beliefs did not disappear. They were woven into the fabric of the rising Khmer culture, becoming a foundational layer for the grandeur of Angkor that would follow. How does a civilization defined by its connections survive when those connections are severed? Funan's story is a powerful lesson in the fleeting nature of geographic advantage, a reminder that a kingdom built on a crossroads can be left behind when the roads themselves change course. These silent cities and fallen kingdoms leave us with a powerful truth. No civilization, no matter how grand or brilliant, is immune to the forces of change. From the Indus Valley's quiet exodus to the Byzantine Empire's slow bleed, we see a recurring pattern, a complex dance between environmental stress, internal fragility, and external shock. The Harappans faded as their rivers shifted, the Minoans were silenced by a volcano, and the Neo-Assyrians exploded from the hatred they cultivated. Yet, in every story of collapse, there is also a story of legacy. The Olmecs buried their monuments, but their ideas seeded the Maya. The Gupta Empire fragmented, but its scientific discoveries enlightened the world. These are not merely tales of ruin, they are profound lessons in adaptation. The knowledge we gain from these dramatic downfalls is not just academic, it is a vital guide for our own time. As we face modern challenges like climate change and political polarization, these chronicles of collapse ask us to look critically at our own society's foundations. Are we over-exploiting a single resource like the Garamantes? Are we building rigid systems that cannot adapt like the Khmer? Or are we fostering the internal unity needed to withstand external pressures? The echoes of the past are not warnings of inevitable doom, but urgent reminders of the principles of resilience. They teach us that sustainability hinges on diversity, flexibility, and a deep respect for the environmental systems that support us. Let this journey inspire you to look closer at the world around you and the history beneath your feet. Which empire's story speaks most powerfully to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you are eager to uncover more of history's great mysteries, subscribe to continue exploring with us. For in understanding how societies fall, we also learn how they can endure.